Holy One, you know that the reflection time is a time when everyone participates. So may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you and guided by you and opened by you. Amen. So last week, this month we're talking about serving or about living our faith. And last week we talked about the call of God, based in love, a call to be more fully who we are and to respond to God's call and to live in the world. And we talked about how call is one of those words that can kind of sometimes seem big and a little bit scary because, we know ministers get called, but I don't get called. But we do, all of us, we get called. We get called to love more deeply. We get called to be better in our relationships, in our work. We get called. And so we talked about that. This week, we're talking about sacred risk. And it's part of responding to God's call. So what I want to start with is the story of the Ascension, which we didn't read today. It's familiar to a lot of us, some of us maybe not so much. But after Jesus died and was resurrected, he was on the earth for about 40 days, meeting with his disciples and having various encounters. And then he invited some of his followers to go with him up a mountain, and he said to them, go into the world and make disciples of all nations. And then he was taken from their sight. And so his last words to his church were the words of recommendation to go into the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And so our lives are to be a response to that call. That's what that is. And sometimes a call is a nudge, and sometimes it's a prod, and sometimes it's a push, and sometimes it literally knocks us over. Either way. So I want to talk to you today about what that's like living that out. Because so often when we talk about living our faith, it can become overly mystical. It can become, I don't know. We need to put some skin on that, right? We need to be able to realize that this God who calls us and also equips us to everything for which we're called wants to continually be remaking us into the deepest, more beautiful version of ourselves. The version where God is there in the core of us and we are living for him. So, to live a life of faith, to live in faith, is to learn how to hear God's will, how to seek God's will, and how to follow God's will. Now, it's hard to know kind of what example to use. And I kept trying to come up with examples in areas I don't know, which is really always bad. It's always bad, right? Probably the first thing in preacher training. Don't use examples from areas you don't know. So, some of us have had years and years and years of experience seeking God's will and listening for the voice of God. And some of us are new at it. And it doesn't really matter how long we've been in the church or haven't been, that we have different times in our life and different seasons. Listening for the will of God when we first start out is a lot like learning how to drive a standard for the first time. So how many here have learned how to drive a standard at some time in their life? Oh, good. Okay, I hit on one we know. All right. So, when I learned how to drive a standard, the hardest part for me was to find that sweet spot, right? Between letting off the clutch and pushing in the gas, right? That sweet spot. And so we did a lot of, because if you don't get it right, you kind of, And one time, we were at a little bit of an incline at a stop sign, and I had driven up and I had gotten the car stopped, and Mom said, had a car pulled up behind me. And Mom said to me, okay, honey, it's good, we can go. And I looked at her and I said, no. She said, honey, it's okay, we can go. You just go ahead, right? So I went like that, and I didn't get it quite fast enough, and I rolled back against the car behind us. It was just a little tap, right? And my mom, God bless her, looked at me and said, well, honey, you're not going any farther back now, let's go. So we did. And, I think she looked back and exchanged look with the guy behind us, and he kind of went like that, because I'm pretty sure there was no damage. It was such a light tap. Anyways, but that experience was really important for me in my life as I sought to know God's will for me and to know how to do it. Because the truth is, when we're trying to learn how to listen for the Spirit moving in our lives, when we're trying to learn how to say yes to God, we're not always going to get it right. And I mean, sometimes when we've been doing it for a long time, but certainly when it's new to us or when it's in new areas. And we're going to make mistakes. Not if we make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Because God has given us a spirit of power and of love. So, what sorts of things might we be called to do? Well, we might be called to work with a financial planner if our financial life needs some work. We might be called to work in our marriage if it seems to not be as full of life and energy as it once was. We might be called to grow in our relationships to our adult children or extended family as they do things we don't like or we're not comfortable with. There's all kinds of things in life, when we move into new areas, when we move into new things that we're doing, and we're called to do all of that with love, right? And so, what's the most loving thing? And so that, back to the call of God, the push, the prod, the nudge, that little, sometimes it's as much as you just can't stay quiet, right? Sometimes, I don't know if this has ever happened, you'll be in a lineup at somewhere, and the person in front of you has been absolutely rude to the cashier, right? And you get to the front of the line and you say something as simple as, thank you for being here today, so I can get my groceries. That's a loving act. I often know that I've hit it on the head when my eyes well up with tears, but I'm an emotional person, right? So the other thing is, I talk a lot about going from your gut, but oftentimes the voice of God sounds very much like a really good idea. And this is important because we can have really good ideas that aren't. But we can get going we can get going with it and then realize it's not, right? These are a couple of ways. If the nudge we're getting is about changing the other people or their attitudes or their ideas or the situation around us, maybe that we need to check in with somebody else. Because quite often when God is calling us to act in love, God's calling us to God's calling us to ask God change our attitudes and behaviors. So oftentimes we don't know we've missed an opportunity until hindsight, right? When we think about what I shoulda, woulda, coulda done, said, thought, right? And we look back and we go, oh, right? So part of living, serving, part of faithful living is to stop at that moment and realize that shame and guilt aren't going to get me anywhere. Looking back on all of the mistakes I've made are not going to get me anywhere. The question at that time, the response at that time is, what would you do with me? What can I do here? How can I act in love? Living by faith is supposed to be a joyous adventure. When we seek to know God's will and seek to follow it in our lives, amazing things can happen. We can be a people transformed. Our lives can be transformed, our hearts can be transformed. Transformation sometimes means change. Change is not always comfortable. So sometimes when we're in the midst of something where we're following God's will, it can feel almost like we're falling apart. I remember at one point in my life I was having a lot of counseling. It was just after the father of my children had decided he didn't want to be married anymore, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with myself, and I was still in school. And I said to a friend of mine, oh my gosh, like I was having counseling and I was, going to church and I was meeting with the spiritual director. I was doing everything. And I said to a friend of mine, I said, I feel like I'm falling apart. And she looked at me and smiled and said, you may be falling apart, but you may be falling together. They look and feel remarkably similar. So living for God, living our faith, means oftentimes as Christians we meet each other in the messy middle. Sometimes we'll have clarity, and other times we won't. But the joy is in the walk. The joy is in the questions. The joy is in the curiosity. And remembering that we're called to leap, that we're called to move, that we're called to try. Because in those moments that we leap, we step out in faith, God can move us, even if we're stepping out in the wrong direction. Because if we're seeking to know God's will for our lives and seeking to do it, God's Spirit can take us, if we head off this direction, can bring us back around and back on the beam. But we need to be trying. We need to be taking those steps. We need to be praying about it. We need to be meeting with other Christians and studying the Word and asking what it speaks into our lives. We need to be engaged and present. That means more than Sunday morning Christians. That means our faith has to be every day of our lives. But that's about living lives that make a difference to the people closest to us, to the people around us, and to the rest of the world. And I can't tell you what exactly that looks like, but I can tell you that if we all live like that, we change things, and we become part of the good that God is doing in the world. Whether we're good, whether we're certain or not certain. So I want to close with this. A lot of times, our faith is a choice rather than a feeling. It's nice to have that warm, fuzzy faith feeling, but in a lot of life, faith is a choice. And so I ask you today, what's your choice? Do you join me in saying, I choose to live for Christ, to seek God's will, and to follow it to the best of my ability? What's your answer? Let's take some time to reflect.